All right, so as you can see, I'm going to talk about philosophical disagreement, and I'm going to do so today with reference to a text by 8th century Jain philosopher Haribhadra, Yakiniputra, and specifically with reference to his text, The Victory Banner of Non-Absolutism. Now, what I'm going to talk about today differs from my abstract a bit, only because I thought I would get some more productive suggestions if I posed my own struggles in the presentation rather than presented the essay that I've written. But this is an idea of what I've gone through for the essay. Haribhadra Yakiniputra has a reputation for being philosophically non-partisan. And in his Anekanta Jayapataka, which is the Sanskrit name for that text, he attempts to make peace between logical opposites, defending what appears to be a partisan Jain doctrine. My essay examines the first section of that monograph, the first chapter, where he responds to the objection that no object having both an existent and a non-existent form can be established except by some form of absolutism, some form of partisanship. In doing so, the essay also attempts to work through his defense of the Jain doctrine of non-absolutism, so his unique defense of that, which is a more articulated form of that doctrine than you'll find in most other places, attempting to draw connections between that text's conceptual arguments and Haribhadra's more general claims about tolerance of and deference to disagreeing views elsewhere. So I've departed from that, and this is the structure of what I'm going to go through today. Just a brief on disagreement, and the reason I want to contextualize this in terms of disagreement is so that I want to give you a brief on disagreement so that you can see where I'm coming from in terms of drawing from this text, so that you can sort of give me your thoughts perhaps on how this text can have some contribution to the contemporary debate on philosophical disagreement. Then I'll give a brief on Anekantavada. I don't suspect everyone knows too much about it, but I won't make the brief too introductory. And Haribhadra Yakiniputra and this text will be the main section of the presentation, and then I'll give some concluding remarks on the various types of contradiction that are rejected as ways of integrating these logical opposites by the Jains, and the one form of it that seems to be accepted by them. So, to start with disagreement. Why disagreement? So, much like familiar philosophical issues, such as the nature of causality, the existence of free will, issues surrounding the nature and significance of disagreement are neither new nor obsolete. They're not new in the sense that direct philosophical consideration of the problem in the Indian tradition is at least as old as Nachiketa's Yama's discussion in the Katha Upanishad, and in the Western philosophical canon, you can see at least a small discussion of it in Plato's Euthyphro, when there's the questions of the gods disagreeing about what is good, sort of propelling the discussion on to another level. In the first case, expert disagreement regarding metaphysical questions gives rise to the truth-seeking Nachiketas having some questions. And Yama's hesitance to expound upon those questions is precisely because of disagreement on the topic. And in the second case, in Euthyphro, the definition of piety as that which is pleasing to the gods stumbles over the gods' own disagreements about what is and is not pleasing. So disagreement-centered debates are not obsolete either. And I think in just the last half century or so, there's been more than enough scholarly output on this topic to give some credence to that claim. Now, I'm going to frame this in terms of diagnoses and prognoses. So for starters, we can note that disagreements often propel a discourse towards solutions. Sometimes they force a discourse to retreat into the safety of certain dogmas. And they can also engender skepticism where previously there was none. There are perhaps innumerable reasons for this variation, whether they're physiological, psychological, due to educational background, or whatever they may be. But the issue has received distinct treatment, not only along these lines, but along disciplinary lines. Right? So you'll see in the philosophy of law that people are trying to address disagreement in a judicial context. You'll also find it in philosophy of politics, philosophy of religion. Right? So despite the fact that these other domains of discourse have treated disagreement philosophically in their own jargon, I think that there may be, this may obscure the theoretical possibility that we can address something like disagreement as such, as a more general topic, and maybe draw some general conclusions that could be fruitful in considering those more specific discussions. So those are various types of diagnoses, right? I didn't actually address too many diagnoses, but what you find in the history of philosophy is that there are many prognoses of how can we solve this issue of disagreement. So Kant's sure path of science in rejecting the sort of dogmatism or supersensible inquiry of classical metaphysics is one example of that. Charles Sanders Peirce's essay on the fixation of belief treats disagreement as a methodological issue, that philosophers are approaching their inquiry in the wrong way, and if only they approached it in the correct way, disagreements would dissolve. But with that in mind, I just want to sort of leave it out there that it's unclear to me, at least, that disagreement ought to be treated as a kind of sickness or as a disease. This is one criticism, for instance, that you'll find in Jacques Rancière's book called Disagreement. I mean, he's basically taking to task this notion that the discipline of philosophy tends to have, that harmony is out there, and true politics is philosophy. Non-true politics is this sort of presence of dissensus and preservation of it. But he finds that his argument is something along the lines of democracy, true democracy, entails a kind of sustenance of that dissensus. So I think there is a potential for philosophically engaging this treatment of disagreement as problematic, right? By asking the question of whether or not disagreement should be treated as a disease. But for now, I'm going to treat it that way, particularly because Haribhadra seems to treat it that way, and the other philosophers that I consider do as well. Anekantavada. The doctrine of Anekantavada was elaborated in conjunction with the Jain worldview from around the 6th century to the 16th century in pretty... you have tomes and tomes of literature on this. A handful of different philosophers have written on this topic. And it begins with Umasvati's Tattvartha Sutra, which is the main philosophical text of Jainism in the logical age, which extends from around the 6th century onward. And this text is accepted by both sects of Jainism, if anyone's familiar with that. In it, the term anekanta is used as a term which represents an ontological synthesis of opposites. So it represents the claim, basically, that every object is manifold in the sense that every object arises, persists, and sort of annihilates. Those properties are simultaneously present in an object. That's a sort of doctrinal position, metaphysical position of the Jains. And the phrase anekantavada represents a position which attempts to articulate how that could be possible, right? How the contradictory properties of arising, ceasing, persisting can be present in one object, made sense of in one object. Now, this doctrine has been appealed to as a philosophical basis for pluralism in a wide range of articles and essays. And in contrast to the thrust of such interpretations, post-canonical literature on Anekantavada within the tradition of Jainism usually purports to establish a victory of the Jain position over others. So the tension that I'm trying to draw out here is just that it appears to be defended rather dogmatically, despite the fact that it's often appealed to as a source of pluralism. One of the most surprising examples of this can be found in the work of 8th century Shvetambara thinker Haribhadra Yakiniputra. So the relevance of this doctrine that I find to the philosophy of disagreement is that one may note, for instance, to start identifying that relevance, one may note that the Jain doctrine of non-absolutism, according to Motilal at least, has developed out of a doctrine called Vibhajyavada, so the doctrine of division, which basically, within the tradition of Buddhism, there's apparently a school of Buddhism called there were thinkers called the Vibhajyavadins. But what it makes reference to is the fact that when a metaphysical question was posed to the Buddha, he would, before answering and before committing unwillingly or sort of errantly to some ontological claim, the question would be parsed out to make sure that you're not making such commitments, right? The idea is that you, before answering a question, you divide it into various smaller questions to make sure you're not committing to any ontological claims. Now, the conclusion that Matilal draws is that with respect to this doctrine, Buddhists develop a position of neither yes nor no with respect to many metaphysical questions. And the Jains, in contrast to that, develop a position of both yes and no to many metaphysical questions. And that, despite that, I mean, that's one connection one can make, but that connection is a bit unclear. So just historically, at least, it developed out of a need to reconcile opposing answers to philosophical questions. And in that sense, it's relevant. But in a more concrete sense, I want to compare the relevance of this doctrine for Haribhadra to a more well-known thinker, Nagarjuna. So, if you'll grant with me for a second that certain metaphysical questions, very general ones like permanence and change, universals and particulars, and their reconciliation in ordinary objects, that these questions, as Ganeri has put it, represent a deeper, more embedded level of commitment, intractable to the upfront reasoning of debate and argument. Just grant that that's true with me for a second. Supposing that these general metaphysical questions have some role to play in our discourse about more refined conventional topics. And if that's the case, then we can grant that this issue in Jainism is an important one to the philosophy of disagreement. So let's compare non-absolutism and shunyata. So while Nagarjuna claims that all things are shunya, or empty, Haribhadra claims with Jains in general that all things are anekanta, or non-absolute. And especially if one is willing to read Nagarjuna's claims as an upaya, Nagarjuna's claim that all things are empty as an upaya, as an expedient means, it can be understood without much of a stretch as a meta-metaphysical claim, right? Because of his insistence on the fact that he doesn't have a view, constant attempt to disestablish ontological commitments without at the same time having some residue to his reductio ad absurdum arguments that will make him simultaneously commit to something further. Matilal has made the same claim about the Jains. Each claim is made about metaphysical claims. It's meta-metaphysical. The positive claim of anekanta could, in this way, be understood as a generalization from the broadly available consequence of reductio ad absurdum arguments, much like Nagarjuna's. Furthermore, they are both absolutisms of a kind. But while Nagarjuna is absolutist about the non-establishment of anything from its own side, by way of meta-position on metaphysical discourse, Haribhadra's is absolutist about the non-establishment of anything from only one side. Right? Something is not just existent, it's not just non-existent. It's both for him, rather than neither. Nagarjuna's diagnosis is the delusion of metaphysical reification, of the reification of concepts to objects, whereas Haribhadra's is the delusion of metaphysical absolutism, or the solitude of some property without dependence, existential dependence upon its other, upon its contrary property. For Nagarjuna, to quote, to paraphrase, verse 14 of chapter 24 of the Mula Madhyamika Karika, shunyata makes all possible, and nothing is possible without it. And for Haribhadra, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that anekantatvam, or non-absolutism makes all possible and nothing is possible without it. Interpreted in this way, both can be seen, I think, they can be seen much more clearly as responses to philosophical disagreement, in that they are taking a metaposition on a kind of battlefield of opinions, to use a phrase from Kant. Right? The main issue in explaining Anekantavada's importance in this respect is that even if there is some philosophical promise to the doctrine of non-absolutism with respect to the problem of metaphysical or philosophical disagreement, the doctrine must be convincingly presented. And the problem that I've found is that it's too often that the doctrine is merely given account rather than given a kind of apology or even an appraisal. So you'll often find articles on Anekantavada that simply explain what it is without actually explaining how it could possibly be the case. There are some exceptions to this. One notable exception is a book by Satkari Mukherjee called The Jaina Doctrine of Non-Absolutism. And if you've read his book, The Doctrine of Universal Flux, which is about impermanence in Buddhism, he has a really wonderful way of making the doctrines he's reading sound convincing. That's one great case of that. And another is a small article by K.C. Bhattacharya, which is about the doctrine of non-absolutism. A bit tough to read. If anyone's read his work, it's a bit difficult, but also a more convincing case is made, an appraisal is made of this doctrine. So I'm going to get into the text now. What I'm going to talk about is the text in general. It's the text in general. Then 3 objections that are made by the Purva Pakshan in that text. And then 3 types of responses that are given by Haribhadra, and then open it up to some questions. The text itself, what I've considered is the first chapter. And the first chapter, this is just the title page of the text in Sanskrit. You can glance through that, but it basically just says the title and the author, and the authors of the commentaries. The first chapter defends against objections to the very expressibility of the most basic ontological structure in Haribhadra's Jainism, which is sadasat rupam vastu, an object of a form which is existent and non-existent, existent along with non-existent. In doing so, it establishes the legitimacy of the Jain doctrine, specifically the doctrine of non-absolutism. And while a complete picture of this Anekantavada of Haribhadra's will require a study of all of these chapters, the first is almost sufficient in that it is fundamental to the claims that will follow. And he takes it to be the most general object that one could begin with. The first chapter is also fundamental because it formulates the objections that will be addressed in the monograph. So the entire Purva Paksha is in this first chapter, and then he defends the first topic of that Purva Paksha, which is the object of an existent and non-existent form. A defense of this object provides the philosophical basis for the analyses that will follow, but also it's been said that this text forms the general basis for later thinkers in Jainism to defend the co-presence of opposites in an object. And that's the difficult thing. So this marks one of the first texts in the history of Jainism that really tried to address the co-presence of opposites rather than try to explain how, in this sense over here, it's non-existent, and in this sense over here, it's existence, which would trivialize the doctrine to some extent. So moving on to the objections. There are 3 main ones that he gives in the Purva Pakshan. Of course, they separate into more specific ones. The first is incompatible properties. Existence and non-existence are incompatible. It's a straightforward objection that anyone would bring up if reading this text or if hearing about this doctrine. Existence and non-existence couldn't possibly exist in the same object. The next is that even if you consider the basic structure of an object as properties inhering in a locus, even if you add that level of complexity, you're not going to find any way to insert non-existence here and existence here, or vice versa, to reconcile them in that way either. Still, they're not going to be a part of the same object. This is the opponent's objection. And that objection takes up quite a bit of space, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, only because it introduces far more complications than I'm really ready to deal with in reading this text. The third, this object is neither observed, so we don't observe existence and non-existence in the same object when we observe objects. First of all, we haven't seen that. And second, it seems like from an a priori point of view, we could rule out the possibility of observing such an object. That's the third objection. So I'm going to go through the actual text here and give you an idea what that looks like. First objection goes as follows. How is just one object, the form of a pot, etc., existent and non-existent? That is, existence is established by the rejection of non-existence. Non-existence is established by the rejection of existence. Otherwise, there would be no difference between the two. For if something is existent, how is it non-existent? How can what is existent be non-existent? This is problematic because of the contradiction of existence and non-existence in one place. And this objection, like I said, is the most straightforward one. And I'll give the responses at the end of this. The second objection, this is just the increasing of complexity here. The Purvapakshan says, moreover, in coming to know an object of existent cum non-existent form, the existence and non-existence of the object are known by way of the object's qualification. So the object is qualified by them. And even here, what is to be said of the properties in the locus? What about the difference between the properties in the locus? Is there a difference? Is there a non-difference? Are the properties identical to the locus? Or is there both difference and non-difference between them? And then it gets a bit confusing in that Haribhadra doesn't make it eminently clear to the reader, or even in his own his own auto-commentary, whether in asking this last question, when addressing the first option, whether the properties in the locus are different, whether he's just talking about existence and non-existence again, or whether he's actually engaging the difference between properties and locus. It's a bit unclear. Matilal gives a translation of this very passage, and he seems to brush over the fact that Haribhadra has brought up the distinction between properties and locus. So it makes it even more unclear to me as to how this works. If anyone has some experience with this text, I'd be really happy if we could go over the passage together. It would be extremely helpful. But the opponent asks, if there is a difference in that respect between the properties and the locus, then since there is a separation of existence from non-existence, how can one object have an existent from non-existent form? So you just have to take for granted that that's a sensible objection for now. Now, as for the non-difference of the properties in the locus, there is a unity of existence and non-existence in virtue of their non-separation from the locus, just as there is a non-separation of a property from itself. So if the properties are identical with the locus, if they're non-different from the locus, then the properties themselves so if non-existence is identical with the locus and the locus is identical with existence, then the properties are identical to themselves, since existence is a transitive relation in that way, right? So just like the non-separation of a property from itself, just like existence as a property is not separate from itself, it's not different from itself, in that very same way, they couldn't be different from each other. On the other hand, suppose there is non-difference from the locus, non-difference of the properties from the locus, because of the non-separation of existence and non-existence, just as there is a non-separation of the locus from itself. Now, just like the locus doesn't depart from itself, the properties, being non-different from the locus, wouldn't depart from the locus, is the basic point. So two subtly different ways of establishing the same point. That if they're identical, you're going to have no way of establishing. If the properties are identical with the locus, you're going to have no way of establishing that these two properties, being identical with the same thing, are different from each other. Right? That's the main point. And difference and non-difference, I'll skip through this since I'm running a bit out of time. It's just to give you an idea of what these objections look like. And finally, the third objection. The object of an existent cum non-existent form is not known because of the absence of the cognition of a form which is both. For example, existence and non-existence do not appear together in vision because of the colorlessness of the non-existent. The non-existent doesn't have a color in our visual experience, but our visual experience is colorful, right? And so because of the contradiction of non-existence in the case of color, and because of the absence of such an experience. So the point the Purvapakshan is trying to make is that we don't have a positive representation of non-existence, so it doesn't make sense to talk about it as a property of an object. We don't experience it as such. Okay, now on to the rebuttals, which are going to make this interesting. I hope I can get them done before running out of time, and then we can move on to trying to see whether this makes any sense whatsoever. The first rebuttal is absence. Haribhadra is going to try to show that if you assume that an object exists only, or that it does not exist only, you're going to run into the absurd consequence that the object is absent. It metaphysically, because it depends upon its incompatible property, because whatever property it has depends existentially upon its incompatible property. You won't find it existing anywhere if you assert such a thing. Next, without its incompatible property, you aren't going to be able to specify what the object is. Objects don't exist in isolation from everything else. They exist in interdependence, and because of that, you won't be able to specify the nature of the object without that object constitutively depending upon what it is not. Constitutively so. And finally, our experience of the object is not, in fact, an experience of just one property without its incompatible property, but a sort of mixed experience of both of those properties. And the reference to non-a priori is just that with reference to the law of non-contradiction, Haribhadra seems not to rely on this your intuitive understanding of the law of non-contradiction is sort of flummoxed when reading his account of how these objects can be, these properties can be compatible or can be made present in the same object. And for that reason, the only way to make sense of it, since he does seem to accept that contradiction is a reason to reject an argument, you have to sort of give a different account of how that law works. And Satkari Mukherjee's account of that is to say that it's not an a priori approach to how this law works. And I'll perhaps give a little more on that when I get to it. So, rebuttal number 1. The object is existent through the form of its quality, time, place, and substance, and is non-existent through the form of the quality, time, place, and substance of another. Therefore, it is both existent and non-existent, because otherwise there would be the undesired consequence of its absence. So, at face value, Haribhadra appears to be submitting the basic Jain trope that it's existent in this respect and it's non-existent in this respect. And in that sense, you have to acknowledge that it both exists and doesn't exist. That's, of course, unsatisfactory. But in his elaboration of this point, what he does is he conducts a reductio ad absurdum proof upon two assumptions. The first assumption is that assume the object exists alone. And he comes to the conclusion that because its existence is essentially sort of bound up with its non-existence elsewhere, then asserting existence alone will lead you to the absurd consequence that its existence sort of extends everywhere. It's sort of omnipresent without that distinction. And that omnipresence of its existence where it also isn't, leads to the object being where it isn't, which is a kind of absence. Right? And the contrary argument is much easier to follow, whether convincing or not, in that assuming that the object simply doesn't exist will lead to its absence. Right? Rebuttal number 2, which is the point about specification, Haribhadra goes through a moment of frustration with his hypothetical opponent, and he says, you say, the very existence of earth and substance is the qualified non-existence of water, etc. Yet, not even then do you know the object of an existent from non-existent form. Not even then do you know this anekanta object that I'm trying to articulate. Such a blunder is unprecedented. Having renounced the dual form, the presence and absence of the existence of the object itself and what is other from it, the specificity of the object is not possible. An object's sort of location like I said, is not in a vacuum on Haribhadra's account. An object's location requires it constitutively what it isn't. That makes the object really big, in fact. Right? So if you think about that, that makes the object very big. It's almost like the whole universe is a sort of infinite manifold object in which one object is constitutively dependent on everything that it isn't, and to fully understand it would be to understand it as a sort of localized perspective upon the whole. That's what it starts to look like. Rebuttal number 3. Sure, I'm just about ready to wrap it up. Okay, I'm going to skip rebuttal number 3 just to go to the concluding remarks on contradiction, which shouldn't take long. So let me just bring this script up again. Okay. Now, in responding to the accusation of contradiction, Haribhadra makes clear that he doesn't reject the law of non-contradiction or anything like that. I'm inclined to side with Aristotle that intelligibility depends upon the acceptance of such a thing. But what he does is he says that if you divide the locus of an object, so just like this is both chrome and black, and I say, someone says, well, it can't be both chrome and black. Which is it? Is it chrome or is it black? And I say, well, here it's chrome, here it's black. Dividing the locus in that respect will not do to excuse the Jain claim from the charge of triviality, right? It won't do. Similarly, if you combine the predicate existent and non-existent into some conglomerate predicate like inexpressible or something like that, similarly, that won't do. Because then you just have one predicate. You're not giving an object of dual form, which is the claim that's being made. If you redefine the terms in the way that, say, Kant does in his antinomies to show that these metaphysical positions, arguments, although valid, are speaking past each other in a certain respect, that's also not going to do it, because what that's doing is taking a disagreement and explaining it as not really a disagreement in the first place. I think what the potential that the Jains have in this doctrine, even if not yet convincing, is that they are Haribhadra is attempting to define an object which actually integrates disagreeing views constitutively into one basic ontological thing. That is, of course, difficult to do, but I think this is the most important aspect of the doctrine. And I guess I'll just leave it to questions for now. And I have a few more things that I'd like to discuss, but maybe they'll come from questions. So let's leave it at that. Sure, I'll field my own questions. That's fine.
So I'm trying to get a picture of what this ontology kind of looks like. My understanding of the reason for the Buddhist sort of constant negation of ontological claims is to sort of pacify ontology, to make people sort of not be obsessed with a single commitment to a single view of how the world is. Is this trying to pacify ontology as well in a similar sense, or what does the ontology look like?
There's still a sort of soteriological picture at work in Jain philosophy, and in particular in the work of Haribhadra. So most of his work is on yoga, and where he's particularly appropriative of non-Jain schools is in this work on yoga, where he's totally willing to use the vocabulary of other traditions, and he's self-professedly a kind of non-partisan writer. So that's at work. There is a sort of soteriological goal here. And to make the connection, you might say that, so for Nagarjuna, for instance, moha, or sort of metaphysical delusion of reifying objects, is an attachment that is the sort of root of attachment. This metaphysical commitment is the root of attachment. And so the goal, so renouncing all attachment or giving up all attachment would amount to giving up commitment to ontological reals or something like that. With Haribhadra, the point is to give up metaphysical absolutism. So taking one aspect to be a tenable description of an object on its own without being constitutively sort of bound up with its contrary is a root of attachment in a way. So treating properties as isolated with reference to an object without reference to their other. So does that make some sense?
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're trying to say is it is similarly an attempt to pacify ontology.
Yeah, in a way.
But I'm wondering, so that seems a little bit strange to me, given that there is a definitive answer, and the definitive answer is both, existent and non-existent, right? And that doesn't seem too much like a pacification. Yeah. So when you get So I don't want to go too much into the other doctrines, which are often grouped under the heading of Anekantavada. But Haribhadra in particular takes Anekantavada to be synonymous with Syadvada. It's not always considered synonymous with that, but he takes it to be synonymous with that. And Syadvada, something like the doctrine of somehow. Syad means somehow, or in a certain sense in Sanskrit. What is being done here is he's trying to point out that in giving full account of an object, commitment to one property or another leads to a kind of biased account. It leads to an untenable one. And for him, he has this notion of kutarka, which he talks about in his works on yoga. Kutarka means mere logic, or a kind of logic for its own sake. That's a bad thing. And for him to make arguments about kutarka being a bad thing, and then to go on and talk about this ontological object for its own sake without any reference to soteriological gains or lessening of attachment would be surprising. I'm not sure how to make that connection as concretely as you seem to be asking, but it's there. I mean, there's the concepts are there in his work to make that connection. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, I was curious about the beginning where you started in saying you wanted to try and draw some sort of significance to the general debate over the significance of philosophical disagreement.
Yeah.
Disagreement explored philosophically.
Yeah, sure.
Two different things.
Sure. Yeah.
And then you sort of immediately said, well, we can sort of get at something called disagreements, and then you went through all of this. So my first question is sort of, what is the connection you do see at the end of this between that, given that a lot of the literature on disagreement focuses on things where we're not talking about whether something exists and doesn't exist at the same time, but it's about political disagreement, or it's about, for example, more relevantly, the issue of the epistemic significance of disagreement, the fact that you and I are peers in a certain sense.
Yeah.
When we disagree, should we update our beliefs, hold our beliefs?
Right.
That's typically the literature that people see on what's known as the epistemic significance of disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot to pull from Anekantavada that has to do with disagreement, but what came to my mind wasn't the direction you went. So I'm curious, what is the direction you see between what you did pull and where you see it hitting the bigger target?
Yeah, well, so the reason I went to Haribhadra for this is because of his reputation as a nonpartisan philosopher. And Jainism in particular, when it's talked about as a source of, a potential source of defending some position of philosophical pluralism or something like that, Anekantavada is often the first doctrine that's appealed to. And then the number one thinker appealed to with reference to that doctrine is Haribhadra. So I thought, with his work on yoga, maybe if I explore his work on Anekantavada, I could find some connections, some more secure connections. What I am finding is that I think one can read his position as a meta-metaphysical one, right? So in the literature on the epistemic significance of philosophical disagreement, if we ignore for the moment the notion of an epistemic peer, what you have is a sort of hard case of disagreement in which the reasons aren't available to either party. And in those cases of disagreement, seeing no end in sight on the basis of further discussion, one might retreat into a kind of meta-philosophical position on how the significance of that will play out. And I see, as a metaphysical position, this has the potential to maybe form the basis for some articulation of a position on disagreement as a phenomenon.
And is it that the background claim is some form of pluralism?
Well,
something more specific given their theory of knowledge?
So what Haribhadra has to say about the synthesis of opposites in an object, I think, can speak to whether you're a singularist, say, about interpretation, or something like an integrationist, if you will, like whether the interpretation of an object requires one definitive assertion of a predicate about it, or whether it's possible to assert the opposite. And in what way is that possible? Is it just that based on two different perspectives, those incompatible assertions are possible? Or is it that those two assertions are simultaneously possible, and it's possible to understand them in that way, in the same way, without shifting your frame of reference? And that's a strange claim. It's a claim that I'm certainly not convinced of at this point, but I think that's the promise of this work, is that if I can at least read him in as charitable a way as possible, perhaps there's something there to be found. And I'm hoping that I can, and if it's not there, it's not there, right? But thanks for your question. Yes, please. Sure, last question.
Okay. I mean, there's not this issue here. The doctrine of Anakantivada is an explanation of how different people can have different metaphysical takes on a situation and both equally be right. Okay? The trouble is that Anakantivada is itself a metaphysical doctrine about the nature of reality, and Haribhadra is committed to defending that. So if a guy comes along and says, hey, no, you're wrong, okay, he can't apply Anakantivada to that view. He's committed to it. So this is a standard problem for relativism, okay? How can you say everybody's right and then say that when someone disagrees with you, you're right and they are?
Yeah, well, my first response to that would be that when you look to the actual philosophical literature within Jainism on this topic of Anakantivada, it starts to look a lot less like the position that everyone's right, and it looks more like everyone's in fact wrong. And so what you find, for instance,
everyone else is wrong.
Everyone, yeah, sure, everyone else is wrong, but every absolute position is wrong. So it looks more like a kind of it looks less like a kind of facile relativism, and more like so I made reference to this earlier, the residue of reductio ad absurdum arguments. So for Nagarjuna, there is none. Right? He's insistent that just because I've refuted you doesn't mean I'm making some opposite claim. I'm simply disestablishing your ontological commitment. For Haribhadra, for Samantabhadra, and for other philosophers like him, what you have is, say, a reductio ad absurdum argument which shows that existence alone can't be a property of an object without its opposite. So if you say, absolutely, it exists alone. If that is refuted, what you get is somehow it doesn't exist as a sort of residue of that reduction. Then you take the opposite and show that it doesn't exist alone. It non-exists alone. The reduction of that argument gives you somehow it exists. And then you have somehow it exists, somehow it doesn't exist, both as the sort of residue of a reductio ad absurdum argument. And so you get this sort of complementary, perhaps, presence of non-absolute assertions of predicates within an object. So even though in the end he's saying somehow this, the way that these thinkers get there is not to say from the start, everyone's right. It's actually a refutation of the absolutist positions that gets to that synthesis. So does that make some sense?
Okay, but is his own view just as shared?
Sorry?
Is his own view just as shared?
I don't think so. I think it's more...
So it's not the case that all these metaphysical views are shared?
Yeah, that's a good question. He doesn't talk about the question of what syad means in Syadvada as closely as other philosophers have. So Madhisena, for instance, talks about it as asserting in a certain way that something is, not not simply saying maybe, right? And that's to be understood in, as say in scriptural interpretation, it's to be understood that there are some claims which are qualified in that way, and others which aren't. And with Haribhadra, it's unclear to me at this point whether he is saying syat with respect to his doctrine or not. But thank you. Thank you very much.
What?
I don't know how to stop.
Okay, but it was recording?
Yes.
It's still recording? Okay.